title of the session this morning, I gave it this. I don't remember what it says in your book exactly, but I've said the necessity of leadership, and I'm actually going to come at it from the backside and talk more about passivity than leadership to defeat passivity. There's a lot of angles you can discuss leadership from, and there's a lot of resources to do that. There is tons of books on leadership, and we've done some of that in men's fraternity studies. Our study on the conviction to lead, I think, is one of the best that we've done, and I believe those videos are still out there and available on YouTube. So if you can find that on YouTube, or if you need help with that, you can talk to Aaron or me or one of the other guys, and we can probably help you find the men's fraternity videos that are out there. But leadership is mainly defeated by passivity that resides in men that came about as part of our sin nature, and we're going to discover that this morning. So I'm going to talk about passivity and the attempt to defeat passivity, and primarily doing that because you'll see in just a few minutes when we forged a definition together of manhood, rejecting passivity is part of that definition. And so we're going to be talking about that. I wanted to read this story to you. I think that some of you maybe have heard this illustration before. A morbidly obese Ohio man has died after police found him fused to a chair he had not moved from in 2 years, and were forced to cut a hole in the wall of his house just to get him out. The unnamed 43-year-old man's roommates called police, who found him unconscious. He was taken to Wheeling Hospital nearby in West Virginia, where he later died. A hospital spokesman would not comment on the man's death. The man lived with 2 able-bodied roommates, including his girlfriend, who officials said fed him since he never got up. The roommates called police upon finding the man unresponsive on Sunday. Officers who responded to the scene said that the man's skin was fused to the fabric of the chair and that he was sitting in his own feces and urine with maggots visible. One officer said it was the worst thing he had ever responded to. Another told the local TV station he had to throw away his uniform after helping remove the man from the chair. The landlord said the man used to be an active person and said she had no idea how bad his condition was since he covered himself with a blanket every time she came to visit. That is the epitome of passivity. How do we get to the point of passiveness that occurs? Not only passivity on his part, think about the roommates and their passivity not to intervene or to act. We know of spiritual conditions that are much more dangerous than that physical condition at times, though, in our own lives, in our homes, in friendships we have with people, and we're failing to act. We're letting them become fused to the sinfulness of their own lives. Maybe maggots visible, spiritual maggots, spiritual decay visibly happening, and we're ignoring it, right? Passivity is deadly, not just physically, like we read about, but spiritually as well. Here's a definition of passivity: the tendency of a body to persevere in a given state, either of motion or rest, till disturbed by another body. So, the opposite of passivity is not necessarily activity. Right? Passivity is the tendency of a body to persevere in a given state, either of motion or of rest. We might think of passivity as just there's no activity at all. Right? So we see people at church, we see people in their homes with their spouse, with their children, and they're active. Well, they're not passive. They're doing stuff. They're involved. There's busyness in their life. No, they may just be in a given state, persevering in a given state of motion. May be at rest also. But it's going to remain that way until it's opposed by another body. Another definition of passivity is this: opposed to activity. All right. So it may be a continuous state of activity, but you're opposed to anything adjusting that activity. Right. So no activity can be the sign of passivity, but that's not necessarily the case. Getting active at church, there's been a lot of people who are actively involved in the lives of their family members and the life of the church that spiritually were dying or decaying on the inside. So let's not confuse those. Let's think about some examples of passivity from the scriptures. Okay? Adam, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, we know this passage. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Adam was passive on his responsibilities. We see Adam present even as she's acting to disobey God. The passivity didn't start because he stood there and watched to see what was going to happen. The passivity began because somewhere he began to fail to remind her, this is against the Lord's command. The Lord's commanded this. She's listening to the lies of the serpent, of Satan, and has begun to look at the tree, and you see it in the verses before this, and it's desirable, it looks good, this is something that I want to try. It could make us wise, it'll make us be like God, we ought to do this, we ought to try this. And he's gone passive, not being there to go, but the command of the Lord is this. Maybe even passive in his own heart, not listening and obeying to that command, but definitely not communicating it, right? He's gone passive. What about Abraham? We know the story of Abraham pretty well. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 2, it says, Sarah said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. He's been promised a son by God, but he's stopped trusting God. He stopped believing that that promise is going to come about. He begins to listen to the wife of his wife, Sarah, and she comes up with a human designed plan to get this son. And he goes, okay, I'll sleep with another woman. I mean, she suggested it, right? Passivity. But no, Sarah, God promised us a son. We're going to believe his promise. We're going to stay faithful until we see it. We're not going to take matters in our own hand. We're not going to do this another way. We're going to wait on and trust in the Lord. Passivity. The story that revolves around Isaac and Esau and Jacob. It's a little bit longer text, so I didn't print it out in my notes. If you want to turn there, you can. Genesis chapter 25 is where the text comes from. Genesis 25, beginning in verse 19, you begin to hear this part of their story. These are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. And afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding onto Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I'm famished." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "Behold, I'm about to die, so of what use then is the birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Jacob, I believe, most surely knew the prophecy about him, and likely Esau had too. Jacob felt necessary. I've got to figure out how to get this for myself, right? Here's my chance to make all this happen. Here's Esau in a state of weakness. Here's Esau willing in his own passivity to give up on his life and his responsibilities, right? He's active. He's a hunter, right? He's firstborn, but what good's the birthright? Maybe he felt that way because it had been discussed. It had been talked about. Jacob's really the favored one. Jacob's really going to be the leader. Maybe it wasn't ever said, but it's felt in the home. Good story of passivity all over Isaac and Jacob and Esau's lives. All of them display those characters from time to time. What about the story of David? 2 Samuel chapter 11, then it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed home at Jerusalem. We know that story. You know what happens as a result of that story, right? He sees Bathsheba, right, bathing on the rooftop, lusting to the point, I have to have her. Takes her. She becomes pregnant. He calls her husband in from the battle. Tries to get the husband drunk, send him home so he'll sleep with his wife, and then it'll all be covered up. He refuses to go. He sleeps on the footsteps at the palace doors. He does it again another night, tries to get him going. He won't. So he sends him back, carrying his own death notice, right? Take this note to the commander of the army. Carries the note. What am I supposed to do? Put Uriah at the front of the lines, then pull back from him, let him die. Covers up his sin by murdering the lady's husband. And it all began, why? Because the warrior king decided to stay home in the spring. When kings go out to battle, where's David? He's at home. Maybe he felt like he deserved a break. Maybe Joab and the other commanders of the army were saying, "Hey, David, we got this. I mean, this is not one we need you for." Right? I don't know, but David let his guard down. And for a season, he was passive. And in that passivity, he's led into this devastating sin and decades of consequences that followed that one choice on that occasion. Not sure what led to all of his passivity. What about Peter? We leap over into the New Testament. John chapter 21, verse 3. It says, Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will come also." And they went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. This is after the crucifixion and resurrection. And here is Peter. Peter, who is the apostle of action primarily. I mean, when something's going on with the disciples, who's speaking? Who's at the forefront? It's Peter. He's always in the thick of it. Just days before this occurs, Jesus is saying, I'm gonna be destroyed. And Peter says, no, not you. We're not going to let that happen to you. I'll die with you before we let that happen. Peter's the one in the garden when they come to arrest him that reaches and grabs a sword and takes a whack at the guard's head, cuts off the servant's ear, right? I mean, Peter is the guy of action. After the resurrection, The disciples are all sitting around going, what are we supposed to do now? And Peter says, I'm going fishing. And that was not a statement of, I think I'm a little hungry, or, we don't have anything to do this afternoon. Let's go fishing. He was saying, I'm going back to my old life. I'm going fishing. I'm a fisherman by trade. I've been raised to be a fisherman. We've done this Jesus thing. We've walked with him. We've taught with him. He's died. He's been resurrected. We know who he is. What is there left to do? I'm going back to my old life. I'm going fishing. And drew the others with him. We'll go too. And they catch nothing. And I think that's God's providence, that they caught nothing. I think not only is it God's providence, I think it's God's grace. You're going to go back to do what you used to do, and in my graciousness, I'm going to let you get nothing so that when Jesus comes, he can show you he's still the Lord. He still has a purpose for you guys. And it was after this occasion that Jesus drew them in off the boats, restored Peter. Right? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Remember that conversation with Peter? And gave them then, shortly thereafter, the Great Commission, their assignment, so that they knew what they were really supposed to do. Peter had gone passive. What about Timothy? 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of timidity. It's Paul writing to Timothy, but of power and love and discipline. Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord or of me, his prisoner, but join with me in suffering for the gospel according to the power of God. Paul several times is encouraging Timothy in his timidity, in his tendency to maybe push back a little bit from the responsibility, to not step in and do some things. It's easy to fear failure in any area of life. It's easy to look at circumstances going on in our homes, going on in our workplaces, going on in our lives, and to step back, fear of it not working right, fear of maybe not being all that you know needs to be, and to go passive, to become paralyzed, fear to freeze us from doing anything, or to just stay constant. Listen, things aren't rocky. We'll just keep motoring on, and you can see things falling apart, but I'm just going to stay steady. And I've seen a lot of Christian homes where everybody was just trying to stay steady. And years down the road, they go, we don't know what happened. We thought we were doing so good. And now look at all of the disaster. Look at all of the change. Look at all of the struggle. And it looked active because there was motion going on in people's lives, sometimes even spiritual motion, spiritual activity. Attending church every week, we're present, we're serving and active in some things, but somewhere spiritual passivity had set in. Seen too many examples of those. I want us to see that passivity is rooted in sin. That's why I'm showing you all those examples. It's all rooted in sin, right? The passivity is rooted not in inactivity, but in sin. Sin of failure, sin of fear, not stepping up to leadership, not stepping up to boldness or courage. Are we going to be immobilized by the sin of passivity as it relates to our responsibility in our marriages, in our homes? We'd include work and church, some focus on those in the coming weeks in terms of leadership. Consider these statistics about passivity as it relates to our homes. If a girl's father is absent from the home, she is 5 times more likely to have had sex by the time she's 16 compared to girls with 2-parent homes. This doesn't have anything to do with being a Christian or non-Christian. It just has to do where there's 2 parents, there's a better chance that she doesn't have sex before she's 16. Boys whose fathers are absent between the ages of 12 and 22 are 300 times more likely to get in trouble with the law. That factor trumps race, ethnicity, IQ, and income. Okay. 2006, a few years old. I don't know if the numbers would be much different, but the year doesn't matter a whole lot. It shows you the data. 12.9, there were 12.9 million single-parent homes in the United States. Father was absent in 10.4 million of those homes. Single-parent homes. Father's absent in almost all of them. The single-parent home is missing the father more often than not. And the father's absence had negative impact on girls and sexuality and boys and trouble with the law. There was an atheist who was doing research for New York University, and he was doing research on atheists. He discovered that practically all the atheists that he could read about and understand, know something about in the last 300 years, who had fathers who were abusive, distant, or absent. Their absence, their passivity toward what was right. There's activity when you're abusive, but it's passivity towards what's proper, right? Created a spiritual challenge as well. We know this, when a father is the first in his home to become a Christian, there's a 93% probability the families will follow. If the mother becomes a Christian first, the chance of the family following drops to 17%, according to one set of statistics. We've talked about these things before there. If it's a child first, the probability drops even further to 3.5%. I love at our own church the things we do to reach children, and we do it really well. I'm grateful for that. We want to minister to children. We want to minister well. But if we don't have around that ministry for men and dads, and if the church isn't a place that is open and welcoming to men, we're creating a real small, slim chance that just by reaching the child, that we're ever going to reach the family for Christ. Okay. 68 million of the 94 million men in the United States, according to this particular year's set of statistics, 68 million of the 94 million men in the United States did not attend church. Wow. So, when I let out, we discussed this verse. I think it speaks to leadership. Be on the alert. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. Act like men. And don't be passive. The call is to courage and strength. Courage and strength. That's our goal. Courage and strength. The quest that we set out on when we started Men's Fraternity was to create that definition of manhood, and these are the words that we put on it. Rejects passivity. That's where we're camping really this morning. Think about passivity. Accepting responsibility. Leading courageously. Those three words, those three parts of the statement all speak to what we're talking about. Leadership in the home. Reject the passivity. Accept responsibility. Lead courageously. And the other part of that definition, expect God's greater reward. That's not really where we're camping. Social psychologists, Christian thinkers have come to the same conclusion. We've read it in the statistics. Our society is struggling under so much evil because we don't know what a man is. We don't have men behaving like men. Our young men need to know that. Our young women need to know that. Adam failed. The product of that is we all continue to fail in that same area, right? Just continues to repeat the cycle. Leonard Ravenhill tells this story. It says a group of tourists were visiting a picturesque village when they walked by an elderly man sitting by a fence. One of the tourists asked if any great men had been born in this little village. The old gentleman replied, "No, only babies. We all start as babies. No one's born great." Right? The great men we look at, we admire, we see these spiritual qualities, these spiritual capabilities, this desire for the Lord that we go, I wish I was more like that. They weren't born with that. Right? It comes about through them rejecting passivity, accepting responsibility, and leading out courageously. So let's be courageous. Let's act like men. I'll show you an example, okay, from Nehemiah. This would be the practical application piece. Nehemiah, example of courage, conviction, courage that's action-oriented. Stephen Siller had just finished his all-night shift at Firehouse One in Brooklyn, was heading to his favorite fishing spot when he heard the news of the attacks in the World Trade Center. Siller turned his truck around and ran into a jammed traffic at the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. He picked up his 70 pounds of gear, ran the 3 remaining miles to the World Trade Center. Siller never made it home. He took action. He's not going to go passive. He's done. My shift's over. Shift's not over. There's a problem. He took action. He took courage. Courage is action-oriented. Book of Nehemiah. If you want to turn to Nehemiah chapter 2, just going to show a couple examples out of Nehemiah's story. I think you know in general. Nehemiah chapter 2. It came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick?" "There's nothing but sadness of heart." So I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" The king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "If it please the king, if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Nehemiah was ready to act under conviction. He had conviction about his homeland, conviction about what that meant, conviction about the fact that Jerusalem was the place of his God, that God had made promises about his people. And although there was danger in speaking to the king, when he had his opportunity, he prayed and he spoke and asked for the king's help and the king's favor, and his courage brought action, and he was ready to go rebuild it. And he did. Sacrifice is another part of this. Nehemiah's example. Conviction is courage that is action-oriented. Sacrifice is courage that is other-oriented. Courage is the call to act like men. Courage is the rejection of passivity. There's a missionary named C.T. Studd. He went to China with Hudson Taylor. C.T. Studd was raised in a wealthy home in England. He was considered England's best cricket player of the day, but he rejected the fame that could have come with that. He rejected the life of ease that was at his disposal because of his family, because of his abilities, and he headed off to China. He wrote this: "Every true Christian is a soldier of Christ, a hero par excellence, braver than the bravest, scorning the soft seduction of peace and her oft-repeated warning against hardship, disease, danger, and death, whom he counts among his bosom friends. The otherwise Christian is a chocolate Christian, dissolving in water and melting at the smell of fire. Sweeties they are, bonbons, lollipops, living their lives on a glass dish or in a cardboard box, each clad in his soft white clothing, a little frilled white paper to preserve his dear little delicate constitution. Wow. Sacrifice. Courage that's others-oriented. We know that was Nehemiah's disposition, right? Nehemiah said, listen, it's not going to be about me. Nehemiah could have stayed where he was. I don't have to be the one to go back. I don't have to go lead. I'm living in a palace. I'm an advisor to a king. I'm provided for. I'm cared for. Things aren't bad here. But he spent money out of his own pocket and travels. He gets there. He not only leads what's going to happen, but he picks up the trowel also. He fights off enemies. He uses his own money instead of taking the governor's allowance. We're not reading all this from the story. I'm just kind of summarizing. He doesn't take what would have normally been the allowance for a governor of a province of Babylon. Instead, he uses money out of his own pocket, and every day he's feeding over 150 people food so that they're thriving and surviving and eating, and they can focus on the rebuilding of the walls. Sacrifice. Courage that's others-oriented. Faith is courage that is God-oriented. Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 19. Simple little statement of prayer. Remember me, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Faith's the most important component of what we're talking about. Faith depends fully upon God. It's easy for us as men to take this idea of becoming action-oriented and not being passive, and it becoming something that we do. We need to produce. I'm going to make this happen. And it's about our faith. Being God-oriented, turning towards God. Nehemiah didn't care what others were thinking of him. He wasn't worried about the accolades of the people, and he wasn't worried about the put-downs of those that were wanting to stop what they did. He just, God, you remember me according to what I've done. It's about you and what you think and what you desire, God. One last few verses. What might this leadership look like? If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creature. 2 Corinthians 5. We're new creatures. Passivity is part of the fallen nature. We see it exemplified throughout the Old Testament. We saw it in apostles and in the next generation. Passivity is carried forward. We see the danger of it upon our society. But if we're in Christ, we're a new creature. Passivity doesn't have to be part of us. It can be rejected. It can be stopped. Old things passed away. Behold, new things have come. Now, all these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. The thing that we're supposed to defeat our passivity to do, right? Namely, that God was in Christ reconciling the world, to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. And he has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. We can reject the passivity. We are new creatures. We've been given a task. We've been given a direction. We're not in search of what the Lord wants us to do. We don't have to go back to fishing, right? We don't have to go, I'm not sure what God would have me do, so I'll just kind of keep motoring on. No, we have a calling. We have the ministry of the word of reconciliation. We have a role as ambassadors for Christ. We have a purpose to be sharing Christ with others. Does that mean we're all supposed to quit our jobs and sell our stuff and go find an unreached people? No. Why are you where you are? There's the need for the ministry of the word in your home. There's a need for the ministry of the word in your workplace. There's a need for the ministry of the word in your church. And we're supposed to be carriers of this ministry of reconciliation, this ministry of the word that promises reconciliation between man and God and men with each other. We have that call. We don't have to just remain at rest or in a perpetual state of motion that really isn't headed anywhere and isn't doing anything. We know what we have to do. So, some questions for discussion. I'll just get them all on the screen there, and you can snap a shot or jot some of this down. Where do you find yourself being more passive? Is your passivity in relationship to Christ right now? What does that look like? Is spiritually leading your wife or your children in your home? Is that where the passivity lies? Is it accomplishing the work God's given you to do in your job? That's the work that's been given you to do. Work in the secular sense. In serving the Lord in a ministry that He's given you to do, to the work of the church. So using work and ministry is different terms. In terms of courage, which area is most likely to go passive the most in your life? Conviction, sacrifice, or faith?